are officially live with our mics.
All right.
Having coffee in a empty, where are we?
An empty conference room.
Empty conference room.
Presentation room, maybe, not
Yes.
conference room.
Yes. And I am so happy. I haven't introduced my guest yet, but you heard her laugh. I'm very happy that I get to interview her. Her presentation, it was actually a pre-conference session, was the first one I saw when I arrived on Wednesday. And I'm so happy that that was the first one that I saw, because as I told her, it made me feel seen, it made me feel very comfortable, and I really appreciated that. So my guest, ladies and gentlemen, is, I don't have a drum roll.
Drum roll.
There you go. Heather Feldner, Dr. Heather Feldner. Did I say that right?
Absolutely.
Perfecto. Thank you so much for accepting, even though we've changed the date and the time quite some times. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invite. It's exciting to be a part of this.
To chat. Yeah, I'm very grateful that I get to talk to all sorts of people and do these interviews in the AACPDM. I recognize that this is truly a very diverse group of people coming together.
It is.
And it just really makes me feel happy, you know. We're going to talk a little bit about everything. Your pre-conference session was high-tech, low-tech technology for all.
Mm-hmm.
And you started off talking about, well, first of all, you started with a word cloud about yourself, in which you said you're a caregiver of family members with disabilities. You are a spouse, you're a mother, you have disabilities yourself. Tell me more a little bit. How did you feel when you were doing that word cloud? Yeah,
so that is something that I started doing a couple of years ago, and primarily grew out of not only my own developing disability identity and kind of coming into that, you know, later in my life, like over these last couple of years, but also because of the work that I had done during my graduate school, my PhD training, which was in disability studies, right? And so my original training was as a clinician, as a physiotherapist, and that was very much kind of based in that medical model of understanding health and disability and you know, kind of really those medical aspects of impairment. And disability studies was the exact opposite, right? And so it was very much looking at kind of how society perceives disability, how there's different models of disability, ways of thinking about it. And it was going to some of those first kind of disability studies conferences where I got to witness mentors of mine be open about their disclosure, being proud of their identity, and really kind of addressing not only their own background, but their own potential biases, their own potential strengths that are brought to a particular topic or area, right? And so I think it was really important for me to share that because it, I think, sets the stage. I think it's really important for all of us in this space, or in any space really, to kind of acknowledge our own backgrounds and experiences and describe how that both shapes the perspectives that we bring to topics like these, but also that limits our ability to engage in things, right? And so I think doing that, like kind of orienting that in a word cloud type of a thing, is a fun way to be able to kind of talk about some of those things and to try and, you know, share with the audience, like, I have my set of experiences as a person, as a family member, as a professional, and that is one representation, and that it's really important to, you know, learn about other people's experiences and identities and what has shaped their experiences. So
their perception of life.
Yeah.
Do you find that since you have created this word cloud, do you find that people's interactions with you have changed? because sometimes I feel
Yeah.
like when you only say I'm Dr. So and so,
Yeah.
there's just this, okay, she's Dr. So and so, or
Mm-hmm.
he is Dr. So and so, and there, I mean, obviously we're all much more than our titles or whatever, right? And but how your cloud impacted me is, yes, I felt seen, but it also made me feel like it made me feel at ease.
Oh, great.
Right?
Yeah.
So just by looking at that, so I wonder, has it always been the case where people feel comfortable, or do you feel like at some point it was, no, I'm just Dr. So-and-so, and there was this line or invisible veil?
That's an interesting question, because I think for me, I think it's one of those things that might be still a little rare in more of these kind of medical healthcare contexts, right? Mm-hmm. But what feedback I hear is, I mean, it's just very like humbling and amazing to hear, like, like you said, like, oh, that made me feel more comfortable and made me feel seen, and so I hope that is the case for more people, right? And that, I think sometimes, in academics, especially academic medicine, right? Like there's this hierarchy of like the titles and all of that. And I think that shouldn't ever diminish the amount of hard work and effort someone's put into developing their expertise. But I also think that it's our role to be approachable and educate, as an educator, but also to be vulnerable, like in terms of, we're not going to change the conversation about disability unless we're showing, hopefully, positive examples of disclosure and being proud of our identities and who we are and all of the things that make us up, like not only our disabilities or not, but like other characteristics. And so that's my hope that, that starts to break that down a little bit further. And so I've had some nice positive responses to that.
I really appreciate that.
Good.
I mean, you certainly had it with me, and all I saw around the group, and it was a large group of people. It was a pretty packed room.
It was, yeah.
And I saw a lot of people taking pictures and just talking to others. They're like, "Oh, I'm so excited about this session." So
that's good.
It just made me real happy that you started off the session.
Oh gosh, thank you.
Looking at my notes, you mentioned in your disability studies that you studied the different types of what do you call them? The different types of disability models?
Models, yeah,
right?
Or understandings. Yeah.
And one of the slides that you shared and that I took a picture of is the comparing disability frameworks. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the deficit framework and then the diversity framework?
Yeah. So there are... we all kind of interact with and think about disability in different ways. And one of the more kind of dominant ways of doing that, whether that's conscious or not, is this kind of deficit model of disability. And it has this history in things like eugenics and things like, institutionalization. And it kind of has ties with, other groups of people who have been marginalized throughout history, in terms of people of color, immigrants and refugees, different religious groups, right, that sort of thing, women, right, and then obviously like racial and ethnic minorities as well. And so that really, the way that kind of deficit framework positions disability is as an individual deficit that's always inherently undesirable, right? And it kind of leverages this idea of this able-bodied ideal. So the root of the problem, quote unquote, right? Definitely air quotes there. The root is in an individual person. So the solution to that is the fixing, right? The rehabilitation and that sort of thing, or the elimination or cure. The diversity model kind of flips that script, right? And so looking at, it from that perspective, disability is more a natural part of human diversity. It's it's everywhere. People with disabilities or disabled people, whatever term you prefer, are everywhere, right? In every society, in every level of life. And what that model kind of describes is that that people are limited not necessarily by any bodily or mind impairments that they may have, but by the way that society responds to that. So things like the built environment, things like attitudes of others, things like opportunities, equitable opportunities for things like employment, education, things like that. And so because the problem, again in air quotes, is situated outside of an individual and more at a societal or systemic level, then the solution is to, yes, that we need to address, bodily and mind needs. Those are very important, right? Like pain, medication, assistive technology, all of those things are really important. But also we need to address things like inaccessible built environments, and we need to address ableist attitudes of people that, kind of, again, see that able-bodiedness as the ideal. We need to kind of address that. And so it really flips the kind of center of where disability truly is. And so, it's a nice way to reframe the idea that, like, there's something that is maybe inherently, wrong, quote unquote, wrong or unworthy of a person, right? We're saying, no. People are who they are, and they're worthy of every opportunity. And what we really need to focus on is all of the things around it that cause that person to feel that they are not being included.
Right. And
so
I always say, and recently I did a talk for the Colombian Rehabilitation Society, and I talked about ableism, and I said, how we've been sort of sold this idea that to have a disability is a tragedy, and therefore to live with one makes you exceptional.
Right.
Because when I tell someone that I have 18 orthopedic surgeries, they're like, wow, you're inspiring. I'm like, I don't want to be inspiring because I have 18 surgeries. I want to be inspiring because I'm a hard worker.
Yeah.
And because, I love doing my podcast, or because I try to be a good human being, and I try to be kind.
Yeah.
And not because I have,
right.
And I think slowly we're getting there. More and more people are like you, like me, are being very open and very vulnerable about who we are and in our disabilities. Has there ever been a time where, because you, as that word cloud demonstrates, you have multiple disability, not disabilities, but multiple aspects to your personality.
Right.
Has there ever been a time, for example, as a clinician and as a person with a disability, that those two have come in conflict?
I would say not so much conflict, but more so, how can I use this as an opportunity to grow, both personally and professionally, I would say. And the example is when I went to do my doctoral program, I went to University of Illinois at Chicago, which is one of the few PhD programs that in disability studies in the world, right? And so it's a pretty rare and unique opportunity. And when I went, I was one of, I think there were two of us that were clinicians in our cohort. And it was gut-wrenching at first to hear about this side of disability that I hadn't really ever considered before, right? This idea of, that what I was doing in my career that I perceived as helping could actually have been detrimental to someone's experience or identity, that sort of thing. And that was really hard at first. But honestly, it was so amazing to then think about, okay, I have a new perspective. What can I do differently with this perspective, right? And so that was just like a cool challenge to then say, okay, I have this identity as a clinician. I didn't yet identify as disabled when I was in grad school, but how can I kind of sit with that tension and appreciate that that tension exists and learn more about it, and then see what I can potentially do to change the narrative within my own profession, right? And so it's almost like a little bit of like, this is a cool experience to kind of chip away at some of these biases and some of this discrimination from within. It's been really fun. Where I have run into conflict, though, is, you know, I was flat out told by some previous colleagues, this is too divergent. This is two different perspectives. You have to pick one, like pick a lane kind of a thing. And I was like, well, I don't look at it like that. I look at it as an opportunity to really grow and be able to kind of merge some of these ideas and such. And there was a fair amount of resistance, you know, at that point. I mean, I think, you know, it had gotten back to me at one point that, you know, a former colleague had basically said, oh yeah, well, she drank the Kool-Aid. Like they actually used that phrase. And I was like, wow, this is that's terrible, right? And so what was really neat about kind of going through that process is that I can kind of, you know, acknowledge that like we're probably all really ableist, right? Like we've all grown up in this society that really thinks, like you said, disability is a tragedy, right? And so if I can start to maybe think a little bit differently about what I do professionally from that lens, I think that's just a really awesome, like that tension to me is exciting because it's like groundbreaking, right? Like you get to engage in these really deep and meaningful conversations with people because everyone comes at it from such a individual perspective, right? Whether if it's people have lived experience or family experience, or we're all socialized in this kind of, you know, ableist environment and stuff. And just even to be aware of that, it's like you can't go back to your way of thinking beforehand, right? And I love that. I think that's really challenging. And
I don't know if this happens to you, but and this is like a very personal chat in an empty room, but for me, sometimes I feel like, because it took me a very long time to disclose my disability at work, for example, right? I would always say, it wasn't until like 5 years ago that I openly disclosed my disability. I would always say, oh, I had an accident and whatnot. This I have shared before with some other people. But sometimes I feel like because disability is such a wide spectrum, I felt like even within my own community, I wasn't disabled enough for them. You know?
Very interesting.
I didn't look. That my point of view was not valid, and even I still battle with that. Right. Because yes, I have CP, and yes, I've had, you know, so many surgeries and whatnot, but at the same time, I feel like I'm not quote unquote disabled enough, right? So I also battle with that. How do you? How do you deal with that? Do you experience something similar?
I do, I think, because for me, I can pass as non-disabled very easily. You know, if my hair is down, you cannot tell that I have hearing aids in. You know, sometimes when we're in a crowded space and I have to use my amplifying microphone, like I'll set it in on the table and people will be like, what is that? Like, what are you recording us? Like, what are you doing? And then I have to, it's kind of that forced disclosure. Like, I'm not recording anyone. This is, this connects to my hearing aids. Because I can't pick up conversation when there's a lot of background noise. And so I think for me, I wanted to make sure that I was being authentic to my own self, and also to respect that my disability experience is very likely much different than the disability experience of somebody that has a visible disability, right? Or somebody who uses my assistive technology is very compact, very small. There are a lot of people who use bigger forms of assistive technologies, and I feel like there is absolutely a difference in how I might be treated versus somebody who's using like more visible or technologies, and there's privilege in that. And so I wanted to, like, as I have been kind of over the last couple of years, like, okay, I need to be true to myself and say, yes, I am disabled. I need these technologies to function in my day-to-day life. But I also have a certain amount of privilege that is afforded to me as somebody with a less visible disability, as somebody who is educated, as somebody who is white. Like, all of those things are, I try to just think about that in terms of then how can I use that privilege to maybe open conversations and think about that my experience is going to likely be a little bit different than other people's experiences. And I think that's hard because you have to be vulnerable, but you have to also, sometimes it's hard because you're like, oh, I'll make do. And again, we've been socialized to kind of minimize what our needs are. And I don't think anyone should be doing that. I think we all should be advocating for ourselves and for our needs, however similar or different those might be. And so I think there's a little bit of a, I don't know, I think about it a lot.
I do too.
And you don't ever want to do the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, right?
Yes.
But also in realizing that our voices are our power, and reclaiming that from a society that will say you have your life, your work, your whatever, your being may have less value or may be looked upon tragically because of whatever your situation is, right? And so I think we can push back on that, and certainly use our privilege to do that, but also just keep recognizing that, for me, I still have so much to learn. I still have a lot to figure out, and I'm going to say the wrong things and I'm going to mess up, and it's part of that, process, right?
We are complex beings just by the very nature of being human, right? And so we are in constantly, we're constantly evolving and changing, right? Who we are, I believe. When it comes to assistive technology, and this is also something that you mentioned in your presentation, and it says, who has access to technology? And you provided some very interesting, well, not interesting, but very real statistics about who has access to technology. Tell me a little bit about, obviously, those statistics, but what does it mean in a greater context? What do you think is the impact? Maybe it's an obvious question, right? In terms of, for example, 2.3 billion people have a disability, but how many of those have access to technology? That's something you mentioned.
So the World Health Organization and UNICEF put out a report with a lot of those statistics in, and you mentioned the 2.3 billion, but of those it's less than half, so it's only about 1 billion people actually have access to what they need. And that's a report from 2022 that's readily available online. So I would encourage people to dive into that a little bit. But interestingly, they talked about specific barriers. They talked about, with relation to assistive tech, high cost, lack of availability, or lack of appropriately resourced solutions, right? So things that are kind of created for in a lot of different environments with resources and materials that are easily available in those contexts, right? And the report also talks about how a lack of access disproportionately affects low and middle income countries, countries where there's predominantly people of color, that sort of thing. And so I think that speaks to, again, this level of privilege of like where somebody may be from, or, you know, what their socioeconomic status is, can play into access to technologies. And I think that is something that kind of as a global, in the global context, we need to be paying attention to, because there's an incredible rate of technology design and development, innovation that's happening. There's this huge maker movement. But how responsive, I think we need to keep asking questions about how responsive all of those innovations are to those local contexts where we know that people are not getting what they need.
And also, I think it affects self-esteem as a person who needs that technology, because when you don't have access to something that you need, I feel, and I can only speak for myself, that you feel less than. You feel embarrassment when you don't have access. So it's so important. It's not just a statistic, you know. It's just, it's real people that are impacted by the fact that they don't have access to things that they need to survive.
Exactly.
So you, after that slide, you go to the next one, and you mentioned, is the system working? Right? Obviously, I know what comes after that. Is the system working?
Right. Yeah. It's not great, you know. Like if we look at, and to be honest, we don't have a lot of good data on this. But what we do know from the data that we do have is that there are really high rates in the U.S. The statistics that I'm thinking of specifically are U.S. related. But I do think there are trends that are similar in, you know, around the world. But we know that rates of device abandonment are high. You know, I think it ranges, the US report is anywhere from like 19 to up to over 35% of devices are abandoned. So that tells me there's some design concerns, right, that we still need to address. That there are also maybe some training components that are not being done. We also know that in addition to rates of abandonment being high, we also know that the way that assistive technology is funded, and it's funded differently around the world, but in the US, it's primarily a third-party payer system. We know that there are extremely high rates of denials, ranging from, it kind of depends on the type of assistive technology and the medical diagnosis that's attached to that. But there, I mean, up to 45, 50%, depending on which payer we're talking about. And that is also problematic, right? Because then that brings in the whole thing of like you needing medical justification. It's taking out that, I mean, it's taking out that social piece of it. It's very much framed in that deficit framework. And those devices are still getting denied. And so, you know, it just begs the question, like, what are the algorithms that are happening for those denials? Who's making those decisions? What experience and background do they have? How are folks with disabilities represented in those environments, right? And so I mean, that's like a huge, very complex
and that,
topic to cover, right? But
that speaks to also how just, and this is very harsh to say, and again, this is my perspective, but it speaks to the fact that our lives are not valued. When you look at like people who take care of people with disabilities, like their assistants, how much do they make? How much do they get paid?
very little.
Very little,
Yeah.
right? And what does that tell you?
Yeah.
That tells you that their lives are also seen as either disposable or not important because there is no or very little value to the work that they do. And then if you look at who are the ones providing that care, it's mainly women of color, where it's expected that they provide care. So there's, that to me also talks about just in general how much we have to change the perception that people we as a society have of people with disabilities, of how we're just not seen as valuable because we can't, we don't quote unquote contribute enough, or we can't work 40 hours and therefore there's just a dollar sign assigned to our bodies, right? So it kind of gets me angry when I saw that. It gets me angry because there really needs to be a narrative shift in how people with disabilities like us are viewed in the greater scheme of things, because that impacts everything else.
Absolutely.
Who is behind the denials? Who are those? Because someone's signing those off. Who is that person? And what is his or her perspective, or their perspective, right? So it's all like a chain of commands.
Well, and that's a policy directive, right? That's not what's codified in our legislative protections, right? Like we think about the Rehab Act, we think about the Americans with Disabilities Act, we think about the Tech Act, right? Like obviously those are US laws, but that like there are rights enshrined in those, but they are, it's very much at odds with the policy decisions that are made by, if we look at the, Medicare context, right? Like, which is the basis for a lot of provider policies, you're limited to, you have to prove that this can be used inside the home. It says nothing about community participation, things like that, right? And it has to be tied to that medical need. And, the language specifically talks about like, not for convenience, or, or enjoyment, right? And so again, we're thinking like, okay, well, the goal of assistive technology is to support participation and enjoyment and fun in life, right? And access to employment, education, all of that. But it's just very at odds with, and even like the language within some of those laws and policies are not always consistent either, right? And so it's a really challenging system to work with it.
And to navigate, because you're navigating it, I'm navigating it because I also work in the policy space, but as a person with a disability, and also at work through policy, but you're also navigating as a clinician and as a person with a disability. So we both are navigating the system from different perspectives. I think we have a little bit of time left. So I wanted to, as I mentioned before, we're going towards the end. I requested some questions from doctors all over the place, and I got a couple for you. So, and this is more towards your work as a physical therapist and movement specialist. So let's see. The questions are, they're coming from Carolina Toro from Colombia.
Oh, excellent.
And she says...
Hello, Dr. Toro.
Yes, Caro, you are being heard here. And your questions will be answered just now. And she asks, what recommendations do you have for translating the results of your research on motorized mobility into daily clinical practice in a timely manner?
Great question. So one of the things that we have found in specifically our on-time powered mobility research, so providing really young children, like 1 to 3, access to power and mobility, developmentally designed, appropriate, with all of the kind of supervision and safety that goes along with that. But what we're seeing is that we're seeing development accelerate in a lot of different areas. So access to power and mobility, even if it's short term, we have seen statistically significant improvements in cognition, in receptive and expressive communication, in fine motor, in gross motor, which is the classic argument, right? Yeah. As well as in like social, emotional, adaptive behaviors, things like that. And so one of the things that we have seen, at least locally in the contexts where I do research, is that a lot of clinicians are either reluctant to support power and mobility because they feel like they don't necessarily have the training or the skills. Some of them still do believe, have that misperception that it actually can be a detriment to motor skills. And also sometimes there's just not a lot of access to the devices themselves, right? And so my first recommendation would be to see if there are any, trial or loan programs that manufacturers can provide devices on loan, or maybe there's some philanthropic organizations where you can do a little bit of fundraising to purchase a couple, maybe have them in a clinic space, and then when it makes sense, incorporate that into a child's routine therapies. We know kids often don't get as much early intervention as they need, but what we also know is that it's not an either or situation. It's not either they use power and mobility or they work on motor skills. It needs to be both and. And so even just kind of, having a little play group at the clinic, or saying, okay, out of the month that, this month that your child is coming into the clinic, we're gonna try some mobility exploration for, 2 or 3 of those visits for, just short amounts of time, 10, 15 minutes, that sort of thing. And I think that's really helpful in kind of increasing exposure, increasing access. The other thing is that there's just some really neat guidelines that have come out that are evidence-based in terms of scaffolding your support for a child and using the right types of training techniques. And so for a child who's never experienced mobility on their own, we're not expecting them to drive from point A to point B, right? What we're expecting them to do is learning more about their bodies, learning more about the device, learning that cause and effect, that like, oh, if I hit this switch or if I touch this joystick, that something happens, right? And so even thinking about using some of those guidelines to structure early learning experiences where there are no expectations, they might just sit and you're playing on the tray of the device, that sort of thing. Playing hide and seek, with the joystick to draw their attention to it. Maybe they accidentally hit it, maybe they go in circles, but all of that is such valuable learning experience, and we know it changes the processes in the brain. And so trying to get some trial devices locally into clinics, whether that be through loan programs, whether that be through, philanthropic, building, do-it-yourself, kind of open source solutions. There's just so much that is increasing in the way of kind of open source. If you have access to a 3D printer, like at a library, you can print a lot of things. There are kind of donation and recycling programs that are starting to pop up more and more with tech. And so getting it, making sure it's safe and functional and all of that. And then giving those small opportunities for practice, even if it's just like, hey, let's try this out today. Okay. And that also I think starts to change people's perspectives a little bit on that. So
thank you so much for just sharing all of your part of your knowledge because you have so much knowledge. And so thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure Dr. Toro really appreciate it. And she has one last question.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Could Go Baby Go strollers be used in clinical settings to promote skills in young children?
Yes, absolutely. So Go Baby Go is a program that takes commercially available like like ride-on toys, toy cars, and we make some adaptations so that they're either switch accessible or joystick accessible, and then we do some very simple seating supports, but using really common materials, things like soft foam or pool noodles or Velcro or things like that. And we've seen in clinic spaces that those are a great option to, again, provide that like self-initiated mobility, that on-time mobility experience. And what we sometimes see with the Go Baby Go cars is they're Frozen characters. There's their car, there's princesses and there's superheroes and there's, Paw Patrol fire trucks, and like they're all very kid-friendly, approachable. And sometimes that shifts caregivers' willingness to try because it's a powered mobility device, temporary, short-term, but it is, I think, much more approachable from a social standpoint because this is a toy that a lot of kids use and play with, right? And so it changes the conversation a little bit about like, why is it, why are you using that? What is it for? And that sort of thing. And so I think it's a great entry point. It's certainly not a long-term solution, right? I mean, they're sized how they're sized. There's no adjustment. There's no growth. They're not meant for long-term solutions. They're certainly not meant as a replacement for complex rehab tech when it's needed, but it's a great kind of entry into that idea that like a child who is labeled as typically developing, right, is crawling around, rolling, starting to pull up to stand, 9, 10 months of age, right, 8 months of age even. And a lot of times if we're considering something more complex in terms of power mobility, it's not until much later. And so what can we do to make that a more equitable experience? And so a Go Baby Go car is a great way to kind of get that baseline equitable experience. It's self-initiated mobility. And then that, that may not be a need later in life, but if it is a need later in life, then it kind of opens that conversation to maybe some things that are more complex, that have a little bit more refined, control system, things like that.
So it's not a long-term solution?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're looking at like the first, couple of years of life, 1 to 5 generally. But kids tend to outgrow them, or they might need more complex supports, things like that. But we've done, Go Baby Go cars with ventilator carts attached to them. We've done Go Baby Go karts with a mount for a communication device. So, you can get really creative. And I think that's to rely on the creativity of families and of other clinicians and just of like the maker community. It's just really fun.
Yeah, I think physical therapists are the engineers of the healthcare system, I think, because you're always trying to come up with ideas and devices that might help and for mobility. So when I think of physical therapists, I think engineers for some reason. Yeah. So
and that's my jam. I mean, I love to hang out with engineers. I wound up, that's why I came to Seattle actually from Chicago, as I did a postdoc in mechanical engineering. And so it was really cool because again, like I'm kind of one of the land of misfit toys. Like that's me because I have this, the clinician and then the disability studies and then coming into a mechanical engineering space and being able to use those skills and learn new ones and stuff. So it's a really fun kind of interdisciplinary opportunity. But I mean, the more the merrier in terms of collaboration, right?
Yeah.
So
it's been a pleasure to interview you and get to know you a little bit more.
Oh,
Thank you so much for taking the time. I know we're beyond our time, but
that is okay.
Thank you so much. And the questions from Dr. Toro, thank you so much for sending them from Colombia.
Thank you.
I will, obviously the episode will air sometime this week while we're in the American Academy for CP.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for saying yes.
Well, thank you, Azucena. This has been awesome, and it just is a privilege to get to know you as well, and having seen you from afar at other conferences.
No, I'm very close now.
Yeah, right? Very close.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you. That's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me in another episode of the Cerebral Palsy Answers podcast. And remember, if you have any questions regarding cerebral palsy in Spanish or English, please submit your question to cerebralpalsyanswers@gmail.com or head over to my website, www.azucenagarcia.com, and you can submit your question there. Thank you.